The CLSC is the oldest book discussion group in the nation. Each class since 1892 has created a banner that marks its identity, and each week we choose a CLSC class banner to accompany the selection at hand. Today's special banner is that of the CLSC class of 1998, whose theme was Celebrate Diversity Through Learning. In a tiny Iowa farm town, dozens of men with intellectual disabilities lived in near servitude for more than 30 years, eviscerating turkeys at a processing plant in return for food, lodging, and $65 a month. Dan Barry tells the emotional story of the abuse and neglect these men endured and how they achieved eventual freedom through the notice of a small-town journalist, social workers, and one tenacious labor lawyer. Reporter Dan Barry writes the This Land column for the New York Times, which he's done since 2007. In 1994, Mr. Barry was awarded the Pulitzer Prize for investigative reporting for his work in exposing the corruption in the Rhode Island court system. Since then, Dan has twice been nominated finalist for the Pulitzer, once for his coverage of post-Katrina life, and another for his reportings on the Great Recession's effects on relationships in America. Mr. Barry now lives in Maplewood, New Jersey with his wife and 2 daughters. And while all of those accolades are worthy of mention, my favorite is that Dan and I share an alma mater, St. Bonaventure University, and go Bonus! Dan Barry is actually Dr. Barry, having received an honorary Doctor of Humane Letters degree from St. Bonaventure a few years ago. After I was appointed at Chautauqua, a shared friend of ours sent me a 1998 letter that Dan had written to me when I was editor of the student newspaper, in which he encourages a young editor to be skeptical but not cynical. I know we're all grateful that Dan has brought his skepticism and has helped to shine a light on the great stories of our day. Ladies and gentlemen, woo, okay. He really means it. On that note, please join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Barry to Chautauqua.
That was more exciting than my talk. I guess the class of 1998 doesn't like you, Michael. Here. Oh, my heart.
You're welcome.
Yeah. So thank you, Michael, very much. It's really an honor to be up here with you. You've done well for yourself, my son, and I think you're going to rock it here. Thank you very much for having me. I come to you fresh from the failing New York Times. Thank you. My editor allowed me to be here today if I promised to sell subscriptions after the talk. So donations welcome. I need it for the bus fare back. In all seriousness, it's a true honor to be among you and to be in the company of so many fine journalists. I hope you heard Arzu Gebulayeva's talk yesterday. I was humbled by that, truly. And this morning, listening to Nancy Gibbs and David Vondrelli, I found myself nodding so much that I sprained my neck. Also, a round of applause, please, for the young journalists putting out the Chautauquan Daily. Very impressive, a daily miracle. That was a cheap trick for applause. This is a true story. About 10 minutes ago, as I was coming up here, a woman on a scooter pulled up to me, and she said, "There's a lot of stories out there, young man," and then she rode away. That was it. And that's a true story. And so then the story of the boys in the bunkhouse. I'm often asked how I was, or why rather, I was drawn to this thoroughly American story about the exploitation of 32 men with intellectual disability, all living, as Michael said, in a squalid schoolhouse, all working at a turkey processing plant, and getting paid almost nothing for decades. And there are two answers really, and one goes way back. Many years ago, in another century, I attended a small Franciscan college in western New York State. Does anyone know its name? St. Bonaventure. And I want to say here, right now, go Bonas. I lived in an old dormitory, the oldest on campus, with a bunch of what I would call unformed creatures. We had keg parties, we had water fights, and other activities that did not, shall we say, respect the infrastructure of the building. It was all a tolerated form of minor vandalism. And early every morning, after the keg party, after the damage, here would come a small man named Tony Villani, wearing a dark blue custodian's uniform and dragging a heavy-duty garbage bag behind him. Tony would pick up the plastic cups, he would mop up the beer-soaked floors, he would clean up the mess left by relatively privileged undergraduates from Rochester and Buffalo and Syracuse and Long Island, who were all attending this university ostensibly to embrace the Franciscan codes of love, compassion, and meeting all people where they are. Instead, some students teased Tony. They mocked him for the way he talked. They took advantage of him. They dismissed him as a gooner. And a gooner was the pejorative for custodial staff at Bonaventure, particularly those with intellectual disability. I got to know Tony a little bit. I went to his shabby apartment on the rough side of Olean. I drank coffee with him and I ate with him. I got to know him. He could be funny. He could be warm. He could be a real pain in the ass. And in other words, he was like anyone else. Do you understand? And I am so grateful to Tony because he helped me to recognize this otherness that exists in society, this accepted belief that those with intellectual disability were other and deserved to be segregated. Certainly didn't deserve to be ridiculed as they were, as he was at Bonaventure. To be seen not as one of us. Even at a Catholic university with a Franciscan philosophy of recognizing the dignity of all people. So now jump ahead nearly 40 years. That's how long it took me to graduate. Michael didn't tell you that. So nearly 40 years later, I'm fortunate enough to be employed by the New York Times, and I'm writing a column called This Land, for which I wandered the country reporting on big moments, small moments, happy, sad, profound, and not so. Everything from witnessing the tornado's aftermath in Joplin to attending a reunion of retired burlesque queens. That was enjoyable. To following an Ecuadorian immigrant who worked as a housekeeper at a Trump hotel in Las Vegas and what that was like. To spending time in a retirement home in Jacksonville, Florida, where I interviewed the man who played the coroner in The Wizard of Oz. Anyone know that movie? I don't know if it's not that popular, is it? But he taught me a song. As coroner, I must aver, I thoroughly examined her, and she's not only merely dead, she's really most sincerely dead. Thank you. That concludes my speech. I'll be playing at the Castle in Olean Thursdays through Saturdays. The Castle isn't there anymore. So this column of mine meant that I spent a lot of time scouring the news websites of all 50 states, looking for reasons to be someplace, looking for stories that said something about this great country. One day I decided I hadn't been in Iowa recently. We've all had that feeling. So I began going through the websites of some Iowa newspapers, and I saw a small news item, and it couldn't have been more than 100 words. And there were certain phrases, a multi-million-dollar jury verdict in the favor of 32 men with intellectual disability, living in a squalid schoolhouse, eviscerating turkeys in a meat processing plant, and being paid the same $65 a month for decades, roughly 35 years. Now, a note here, since we are celebrating journalism, or at least exploring journalism, that brief item that I read was in great part due to the fine work of investigative reporting by a man at the Des Moines Register named Clark Kaufman. And he really brought this to the fore in Iowa and certainly wound up bringing it to my attention. The jury award, which was later drastically reduced, for caps on on such awards in terms of damages, represented punitive damages as well as compensation for emotional harm, and this is the legal term, okay, for the loss of enjoyment of life. That's such a powerful phrase, the loss of enjoyment of life. I was gobsmacked. I knew I had to write about this case, so I called up the attorney who was handling the matter for the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, a man named Robert Canino, and he's just a flat-out hero. He advocates for people who are taken advantage of in the workplace, and even to this day, he is involved in the lives of these men. In fact, he had several down to his house in Dallas, and he took them to a NASCAR event. I mean, that's the kind of guy he is. I didn't know him then, so I called him up and I said, look, I want to write about this. And quite frankly, the story hadn't gotten a lot of attention outside of Iowa. I don't know why, but it seemed to stop at the state border, because I had never heard of it until I saw that little item. And I said, Mr. Canino, I'd really like to write about this, but in order to do so, I need to talk to the men themselves. Okay, before I fly out to Iowa, I want to make sure that I'll have access to these men, because I didn't want to be one of these reporters who wrote about them, around them, really, without including them in their own narrative. To me, that would be empty and hollow. I wanted the men to tell me themselves, or to have voice in the telling of their tale. And he said, well, geez, no one has spoken to them. And I said, why not? And he said, no one has asked. So there it was, right? The Oz got it, right? There was that otherness, that historic segregation of people who have endured so many pejoratives over the centuries, from feeble-minded to mentally retarded. You can see them, those words actually, still carved in buildings around New York State and around the country. No one had asked, perhaps, because people with intellectual disability were still being seen as them, not us. And so as a result of that phone call, and as a result of Mr. Canino's help, I had the privilege of meeting and getting to know many of these guys, Billy and Robert Penner, and Henry Wilkins, and Raymond Vaughn, and Carl Wayne Jones, and one guy named Willie Levi. And so I'm just going to read a little bit about him. It's from this book. First thing, get them birds out the coop. When the truck sighs to a stop and the turkey plant's feather-flecked dock, it's time to unload. You open a crate and grab a 40-pound turkey that wasn't too happy about being caged in the first place, but sure as hell doesn't want to leave it now. He knows, he ain't stupid. He can tattoo you black and blue just by beating his wings. So grab him by the legs, tuck him under an arm, and flip him. Then hang that bird, hang him, upside down on one of them shackles moving toward the plant's mouth. Watch him get swallowed up. Willie Levi did this hundreds, thousands of times a day for years, for decades, turning the shit-flutter task into an artistic performance of movement and sound, like some austere of slaughter. He was the turkey whisperer. He talked to the birds, and they talked back, as if sharing an interspecies understanding about the fetters of fate. He puffs out his cheeks and summons his turkey song from somewhere deep within, a haunting aria unrelated to the gobble-gobble of child's play. Guttural and true and anxious and mournful, Willie's song carries an insight earned from having spent nearly as much time with turkeys as with humans, on scratched dirt ranches and hen houses and tom pens, on the loading docks, along the assembly lines of evisceration in Texas, Iowa, Missouri, South Carolina, his clothes flaked with their guts and fingernails caked with their blood. His shelter, his food, his paltry earnings, his every joy and sorrow were controlled by a company whose very name invokes the damn bird that dictates his life, Henry's Turkey Service. But Levi did more than talk to these panicked creatures. He eased them into an acceptance that their time had come, comforting them in their final moments. I pat him on the belly when I get him on the shackle, he says. I say, okay, Tom, okay, quieten it down. Get them out the coop, he says, send them off to the kill room. Time for Willie Levi is either today or not. Today, he might remove the 2 plastic white spoons he keeps tucked into one of his socks pulled high and beat out a clickety-clackety rhythm. He might tell you he prefers being called Levi, just Levi. He might get depressed and fall quiet, or he might sing one of those hymns he came to know so well as a robed member of the Sunshine Singers, a traveling choir at the Mahia State School. He remembers all them songs, he says. What a friend we have in Jesus. He's got the whole world in his hands, that old rugged cross. Today is today, and one day closer to his favorite day of the year, his birthday, which he will tell you whether it's the day before, the day after, or Christmas, his wandering left eye measuring your reaction to the news. August 19th, 1946, 2 days from now, is Levi's birthday. August 19th, 1946 is the thick, muggy day that Willie Levi is born in the eastern Texas city of Orange. His father is a mill worker when he works. His mother is a hotel maid who knows from the moment she holds her first child that he is mentally deficient, as a state report would later put it. If there is a normal to his family, to his time, he did not act it. What has transpired from that blessed day until today is the time contracted past for Levi, a jumble of many moments, any one of which could have happened a half year ago or a half century ago, but today is today, and what a friend we have in Jesus. Doctors advise Levi's mother that her firstborn should be placed in an institution, but she chooses not to hear all the fancy words that come down to separating mother from child. So Levi goes to school with all the other poor black children in that part of Orange. And soon, Levi is a man boy of 19. His alcoholic father is nowhere to be found, and his worried, overworked mother is in Rusk State Hospital for the mentally ill. So, one hot June morning, Levi and his sister, Idabel, take a long bus ride with lots of station stops. Finally, they reach some far-off Texas place that boasts of being a great destination, no matter how you pronounce it. But you pronounce it Mahia, almost like a greeting called out from the street. Mahia, Levi. They visit a campus with a sprawl of buildings just outside town. Then Idabel explains that she has to go, but he has to stay. She says she doesn't want to leave, but she has to, and he has to stay at this special school. Levi tells Idabel that he wants to go back to Orange. It is a plea he will make many, many times in the decades to come, as he is taken to places much farther from Orange than Mahia, places out of his home state of Texas entirely, places devoted to turkeys. I want to go back to Orange, he says, and will keep saying, I want to go home. So, Levi has no home in Orange to go to anymore, no mom, no dad, no family. His home is located in today, which is one day closer to his birthday, when his mother held him as an infant and refused to let go, keeping him as long as she could. You'll know Levi when you see him, a wild-haired, white-bearded black man in his late 60s who walks as if in fear of falling. He has a few strands of Mardi Gras beads draped over his burnt orange Texas Longhorn shirt and a pair of white plastic spoons tucked into one of his knee-high socks. Ask him, and he'll sing a turkey song that will go right through you. So very quickly, this is what happened to Levi and all the other men. They came from Texas institutions called state schools, which in the 60s and 70s were crowded, costly, and antithetical, really, to the concept of inclusion, of having people with disability living in the community, which was taking hold certainly around the rest of the country, but Texas was late to that dance. A program was developed in which some of the men were selected to live on a ranch in Texas where they would learn basic skills, and it was thought that they could also pay their fair share in taxes. This was a big issue in Texas. The central skill, though, that they learned was really just catching turkeys. Catch the tom, milk its semen, and run that semen over to the hen house where other workers would artificially inseminate the hens. It is dirty, difficult work. But these men became proficient at this task, so proficient that their employer, Henry's Turkey Service, sent them in teams to places in Illinois and South Carolina and Iowa to work in these turkey processing plants, where they wound up with the flat-out worst jobs. And believe me, to have the worst job in a meat processing plant, that's saying something. Their jobs included unloading the live 40-pound turkeys from the crates of those trucks that you'll see on the highway, hanging them upside down on the moving shackles that were sweeping into the plant, and then eviscerating them after they'd been stunned and killed. The men who were sent to Iowa, Levi and all these other guys, wound up living in an old schoolhouse in a very small town called Atalissa. How small? The Chautauqua campus is more than 3 times the size of Atalissa. Its population was maybe 200 at the time. But that population dramatically increased with the sudden influx of dozens of men with intellectual disability, a segment of our society that over the millennia has been tolerated, institutionalized, ostracized, and worse. In the early 20th century, for example, the pseudoscience of eugenics advocated sterilization and even banishment to an island. It was for the better, the argument went, because people with intellectual disability posed a threat to the superior American stock. These people have been called innocents and cretins, from the Swiss French word for Christian, and simpletons like Simple Simon, who met a pieman going to the fair, and idiots like Johnny in the Wordsworth poem, The Idiot Boy. In Adolissa, though, they became just the boys, embraced by some, ridiculed by others, just the boys, men in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, the boys. An argument might be made, I'm not saying it's a sound argument, that these working and living conditions began with good intentions. The men were out of institutions, they were well fed, they were initially being challenged at work. The converted schoolhouse they lived in had television sets and stereos and exercise equipment. On weekends they went on camping trips, they went to Walmart, and on Sunday they went to the local Lutheran church where they sang, I have to say not always on key, but they sang in a choir, and they became an integral part of that service every Sunday. But the men were segregated. They had no choice in what they ate or where they lived or whether they even wanted to work in a turkey plant. They were also denied access to the social services and outreach programs that were available in the local county government. What's more, they were being paid less than what was being paid to a non-disabled person doing the same damn job under a federal labor law that historically has been ripe for abuse. So very early on in late 1974, maybe a few months after this program began in Iowa, a social worker for the state of Iowa recognized it for what it was, virtual servitude. He wrote a scathing memorandum to his supervisors that was, of course, ignored. This became the pattern, in fact, over the years, with other warnings, anonymous tips, disgruntled former employees, news stories, all of them ignored over the decades. The bureaucracy of social services got in its own way. They found reasons not to investigate, and I found memos attesting to this, where you could see these middle management people in the Social Services Department of Iowa really trying to figure out how not to deal with it. Okay, this isn't really a group home. What is this? It's Texas's problem. So what happened as a result? Nothing. As the governor would later say, the state of Iowa simply failed these men. The system devolved over the years. The schoolhouse fell into disrepair. Windows were boarded up. The ceiling leaked. Cockroaches ran rampant. The place became a fire trap. And at the same time, the physical and emotional conditions of the men also declined. Their teeth rotted. Their feet and legs developed infections. Their hands became constricted. And their hands became constricted because of the work that they were often doing in the plant. Their hands were like this, okay? And that was from the repetitive task of reaching into the innards of a turkey and pulling out the craw and throwing it into the trough over and over and over again. So after a while, their hands were like this. And these were only the physical manifestations of the neglect and abuse that they endured. There were head slaps and kicks in the groin and lots of name calling. The men were told constantly that they didn't work hard enough, which really, really ticked them off. Throughout, though, the men showed a resilience, a kind of a fraternity. At times they had really no one else but themselves. The men suffer one another's abuse collectively as if they are all Tommy Johnson being handcuffed, or Henry Wilkins being forced to eat jalapeno peppers, or Raymond Vaughn carrying weights while walking in circles, or Jeff Long denied the use of his own television because he didn't feel like working one day. This was an old schoolhouse, so there was a gymnasium attached to the schoolhouse, and one of the punishments, if you were deemed not to have worked hard enough, was that you had to carry weights around the gym, and there was a big pole in the center of the gym. And another punishment was, after work, you had to keep both hands on the pole and not move for an hour or two, okay? Normal punishment, right? And every now and then, someone rises in defiance, as when Billy Penner stood up for Willie Levi after his friend was ordered once again to grab the pole and not move. Levi gets emotional in the retelling. He say, "You leave him alone." He say, "I'm going to deck you one." The men are on their own, unable or unwilling to tell others what it was like to see cockroaches nesting in their televisions and clock radios, to be assigned dehumanizing numbers that made sorting all the laundered socks and underwear that much easier. They remember their numbers still. Brady Watson was 2, Frank Rodriguez was 83, Keith Brown was 175. It was a form of dehumanization, right? To hear another man's repetitive tick as he tries to understand why he didn't get his $5 that week, or why he wasn't allowed out of the van, or why he'd been called a dumbass. "I was doing the best I can," Jeff Long says again and again. "I was doing the best I can." So Pete Graffinino, the cook, tries to keep the bugs out of the food. Robert Penner gives Preston Pait his insulin shots. Frank Rodriguez and Brady Watson do the laundry. Sometimes the clothes just have to be thrown in the trash. And on the rare occasions when the outside world is reminded again of how they are living, through a newspaper report or a tip from a former employee, the actions taken, if any, never interrupt the repetition of their everyday existence. Supper, television, lights out early, boys, because we're doing it all over again tomorrow. The rain and snowmelt drips into pans and buckets placed around the gym, the bathroom, the garage, the kitchen, a bedroom or two. Plinking and plopping, the elements beat their relentless rhythm against the ancient schoolhouse structure, testing, knocking. Something has to give. Yeah, every time I read that, I always have a note here and it says, to tell you that this isn't from Dickens or even from Steinbeck. I have to keep reminding myself that we're not talking about 1937. We're talking about 10 years ago, right? Okay, just so you know. Finally, in 2009, a sister of one of the men asked how much her brother had saved after having worked at Henry's Turkey Service for more than 3 decades, and the answer was $86. She sounded the alarm, and she called every state agency she could think of, short of the National Guard. She called the Des Moines Register and got a hold of Clark Kaufman, who immediately pounced on this story and kept at it for a full year. As a result, all the social service workers, all the police officers, all the county officials, all representing agencies that previously had ignored what was going on with Henry's Turkey Service, descended upon that old schoolhouse in Atalissa. And in early 2009, it was a February morning, the men were rescued, taken temporarily to a Motel 6 in Muscatine. That's only part of the story. You know, it's sobering at the least. It's quite upsetting. But there are also parts of the story that are, I find, redemptive and uplifting. Many of these men were in a state of post-traumatic stress after their rescue. They had been suddenly yanked from their home. They were living in a motel, and now everything in their lives was uncertain. Social workers in Iowa took special care to help them in this transition with an approach that was called Stand By Your Man. I've read thousands of pages about this case, including dozens of assessments written in that matter-of-fact, bureaucratic way, and I am always struck by the compassion that manages to come through, even in some memorandums shoved in a state file. Here's an example. These instant relationships between the men and their caseworkers lasted days but contained lifetimes, as when a young social worker named Jennifer Blake got acquainted with a man who had a slush gray beard, a broken kneecap, and a couple of spoons tucked in his socks, Willie Levi. After introducing herself to Levi late that Sunday morning, Blake began to draw him out. He shared his story, or part of his story, with nonlinear raggedness, naming relatives he wasn't sure were dead or alive, listing all the places where he had chased turkey. At 62, he was unaware of the year, unable to manage his money, launder his clothes, or cook his food, though he could make a sandwich, and he was in need of prompts to use soap. He confessed to getting depressed sometimes and to screaming sometimes at night. Sometimes he tried to hurt himself, clawing at his own skin. Sometimes Blake thought he lives in that space between fantasy and reality. Blake, the social worker, listened to Levi sing and play the spoons. She drove him and a few others to a free lunch at the Presbyterian Church. She stood by as he underwent a physical that revealed, among other ailments, a fungal infection in both feet. She drove him to Walgreens to buy grooming supplies and a photo album. She took photographs as he ate dinner with other men at a local restaurant. She accompanied him to a doctor's appointment in Iowa City, where a doctor determined that his broken kneecap required surgery. At night, she made sure that he showered and brushed his teeth, and in the morning that he ate breakfast and took his medication. When she went home one night, she washed his clothes and the clothes of his roommate. Blake drove Levi to Walmart so that he could buy a James Brown CD with his $5 allowance. She had the pictures developed and placed them in his new photo album. She helped him leave a message for the pastor at the Zion Lutheran Church and shared the pastor's return message that Adelissa missed him and the other men very much. She listened to his new CD and yes, to his Spoons and Comb musical performance in the motel lobby, and also to his confession, "Jennifer, I don't never, ever want to work again with turkeys." So when I always get a little choked up when I read that part where she cleans his clothes and the clothes of his roommate. To me, that's biblical, or almost biblical. About a dozen of the men were returned to Texas to live with family, or to go to lousy group homes, quite frankly, or to live in not a very good nursing home. I visited that nursing home. The rest, there were about 21 of these men. They all went to Waterloo, Iowa, which is, maybe an hour and a half or so from Adelissa, where they became the sudden responsibility of a social worker, another one named Susan Seahas, and her staff at a nonprofit organization called Exceptional Persons, Inc. So imagine being Susan Seahas, getting that call. "We have 21 men with intellectual disability, many in profound states of physical and emotional distress. Help." Susan and her staff did just that. They met the men where they were, they listened, they anticipated, they won trust. They found them in housing, found them jobs, if they wanted jobs, that's about choice. Found them medical and psychiatric services, which was and continues to be needed. Helped them to navigate the everyday world, going to the supermarket, for example. And out of their own pockets, these social workers also bought some gifts for these men, including high-quality bed sheets, allowing the men to sleep in linen cocoons of unfamiliar softness. So imagine that, the first time sleeping in decent linens. Again, biblical. So to me, one of the lessons that the story of the boys in the bunkhouse teaches us is that prejudice continues, as does the need for vigilance, the need to step outside of ourselves and see others around us. After I wrote a long story about the men's plight for the New York Times in 2014, a couple of Iowa social workers who had worked on the case insisted to me that the story wasn't over. I insisted it was. They said that while going through old records, they had learned that one of the Adelissa men, Carl Wayne Jones, had a brother named Leon, who also had intellectual disability, and the two brothers had not seen each other in many years. Henry's Turkey Service had split them up. Carl to Iowa, Leon to South Carolina. The two social workers had tracked down an address for Leon, and it was right next to a turkey processing plant in a town called Newberry. It sounded crazy. In fact, the address was, for some of you, you might recognize, the address for Leon that they found on the records was Lewis Rich Boulevard. So Lewis Rich, you might remember, is still a quite prominent meat processing operation. And I really didn't want to go to Newberry, South Carolina. I was tired of it. But they kept at me, and finally my Irish Catholic guilt got the better of me. It always does. And I went to Newberry, South Carolina. In fact, here's a testament to the New York Times. I know we're slapping around the media, and rightly so in many respects. But I went to my editor, and I said, look, I have to go to Newberry, South Carolina to knock on a door. I don't know if it's going to be worthwhile. I don't know, but I have to knock on that damn door. And he said, go. I mean, the conversation was like that. He said, go. And so I went down, and I knocked on that door. And, first, I go to the address at Lewis Rich Boulevard, and it's a bunkhouse. It's a frigging bunkhouse. It's a series of mobile homes connected sloppily. Some of the mobile homes' windows were broken. I couldn't believe it. And I knocked on the door, not knowing what I would find. And here came Carl Wayne Jones's brother, Leon. He opened the door. He's in his mid-60s. He's living in squalid conditions. He's making almost no money. He never goes anywhere. He's never been on vacation. And his job was to sweep up the dead turkeys that fell off the trucks at the turkey plant. Now, what's interesting about that was less than 3 years ago that I knocked on that door. So this is real time. I'm not talking historic here. So where do things stand today? Henry's Turkey Service is no longer in business, but no one was ever criminally prosecuted. And don't ask me why. I don't know why. In fact, for years, that EEOC lawyer, Robert Canino, hit obstacles in trying to collect any of the court-ordered damages from the company and its owners. They were doing a shell game with their assets. But this is another tribute to Mr. Canino, he kept after. He kept watching. From Dallas, Texas, he kept watching where the money was going as they shifted assets and properties, and he finally caught them doing something they shouldn't have. And as a result, many years later, the men who are alive, not all of the men are alive, some have passed away, they each received so far about $25,000. Now that may sound like a lot to some people, but let's do the math. Right? Let's do the math, not only in terms of years, but in terms of what they endured. So, as for the men formerly of Texas, formerly of Atalanta, and now of Waterloo, Iowa, most of them live in typical houses in typical suburban neighborhoods. Some of the men have chosen to work. Some have chosen to retire, choice being the operative word. One man lives with his girlfriend in Des Moines. Another lives by himself in a small house in Waterloo. That's a man named Gene. And whenever I say that, I always have to stop. It's wonderful, isn't it? He's living in a house by himself in Waterloo, Iowa, with very little supervision. Someone from Exceptional Persons comes and checks him out maybe once a week. So yeah, that's wonderful. That's great. He could have been doing that 30 years ago. That's what drives me crazy. So it's a bittersweet achievement. You might see Carl Wayne Jones eating dinner with his girlfriend at a restaurant in Cedar Falls. You might bump into Gene in the soda aisle at the Hy-Vee supermarket. Or you might stop by the house that Billy Penner lives in with 3 other men, as I did. And he was just sitting there, and he was doing absolutely nothing. He was just sipping coffee he had brewed, and he was just doing nothing. And after 40 years of working turkey, he deserved it. In other words, these guys are living the everyday lives long denied to them, and they're in their rightful place, which is, of course, among us, right? And a final note. In writing this book, I got to know the men fairly well. I took a tour of the meat processing plant. I went through all those records. I visited a few of the state schools in Texas. I watched the old schoolhouse in Atalanta be demolished, actually. I happened to be there when they were knocking it down. The town didn't want any memory of what had occurred, so they knocked down the building. But I couldn't figure out how to end the damn book. So I went back one more time to Iowa, and it's what Woody Allen said. 80% of life is showing up, right? 80% of life is showing up. And I submit that for journalism, it's 90% or higher, so take note, okay? Journalism is being there, not sitting in your desk and opining. It's being there and bearing witness, right? Okay. Dr. Barry. Kidding. So I showed up, and I had no idea what was going to happen. The guys had decided to go to karaoke night. I'm not a karaoke guy. I'm just not, no matter that I could do the coroner. Carl Wayne Jones told me he was going to sing I Walk the Line by Johnny Cash, and he kind of did. Raymond Vaughn was going to do Jailhouse Rock, and he kind of did. But Willie Levi, the guy from the beginning of this talk, he refused to tell me beforehand. He wanted it to be a surprise. So let me tell you about it. And this was just showing up. Now it is Levi's turn. He takes his place on the karaoke stage, his wild white beard in cumulus glory, his harpo-like coat bulging with hidden curios, his 2 baseball caps, the Iowa yellow over the Texas green, secure somehow on his head. The bongo by his side suggests that there stands Thoreau's different drummer, Levi, the mad prophet. He holds the silver-headed microphone as if it were an afterthought, evoking a veteran lounge singer's casual cockiness. Performing in front of an audience has never fazed him, whether in church or at the county fair, and Lofty's Lounge is just the latest gig. Soon, a few basic musical notes start to sound, revealing the song he had refused to share in advance, had wanted to be a surprise. Familiar words flow. Don't know much about history. Levi ignores the words crawling with insistence upon the karaoke prompter. He knows the lyrics as well as those to Jesus Loves Me, and besides, he cannot read. Swaying like a human metronome, he joins Sam Cooke, the long-dead king of soul, in professing ignorance about biology, trigonometry, and the worth of a slide rule. Beside him stands his dark-haired girlfriend, Rose, who is wearing a teal hoodie that matches her sneakers. The two have already slow danced and swapped kisses, and now they are rocking in sync to the music. She holds a microphone too, but leaving the singing to Levi and Sam. Maybe by being an A student, baby, I can win your love for me. Lofty's Lounge is a busy place. Not everyone is listening. What Levi sees as he looks out from the stage is the scrum of America framed by a bar's wood-paneled walls. Billiard balls being clacked under a Bud Light lamp. Waitresses in black delivering burgers and fries. Cans of soda, Pepsi and Diet Pepsi, Mountain Dew and A&W root beer. Cluttering the fold-out tables. Men hunched to the contours of the bar counter, peering up at a television game show. NASCAR decals and Budweiser posters and Arrow liqueur bar mats and University of Iowa Hawkeye t-shirts and clutches of people in private orbits, talking as a man serenades them from the stage. And I know that if you love me too. But Willie Levi, formerly of Orange, Texas, pays no attention to the attention not being paid to his plaintive request. He once sang turkey call songs that summoned birds to their death. No more. With one arm draped around his girlfriend, he joins Sam Cooke in imagining the wonderful world that could be. This now is the song Levi sings. Thank you. Tell them I refuse to take questions.
As is our custom, we will take questions, alternating left for right, and we have a little bit less than 20 minutes before I have to whisk Dr. Berry across the Grove to a book signing, so feel free. And I'm going to attempt to put this banner back up and not have it fall on you.
I'll just stand here awkwardly.
I've got a question over here. Thank you so much for your amazing work.
Thank you.
I don't imagine anyone was paying Social Security for them or Medicare. I mean, how have they been fit back into the system?
How have they now been fit back into the system? When exceptional persons began handling their cases, one of the first things they did was set them up with case managers and such, and so they were included now into the system in Iowa. Henry's Turkey Service basically kind of hid them and didn't participate in any of the social services in Iowa. So when they were rescued, in addition to being taken care of physically and mentally and all that, that was the very first thing they did, so that they could in fact get some of the medical and psychological coverage.
And Social Security checks?
Yes. Oh yeah, now they're getting SSI. Yes. Yes.
Good.
Yeah, but it's a good question why they didn't have it all along. So, yeah. Hurry.
You look good, awkward. So.
Thank you. I know, it's true.
To what extent is this stuff still going on? What you were just talking about was like 3 years ago. Do you have any sense for what's going on still, and if what you've done and what's happened in Iowa has...
In terms of these men or in terms of this issue?
In terms of the issue of people like these men being taken advantage of.
Yeah, thank you. It's first of all, it's heightened. The case of the men in the bunkhouse has now become a standard reference for new employees at EEOC, in the Department of Justice, and elsewhere. Advocates study the story. I'm not saying they study the book, they study the case of the men in the bunkhouse. That's one. Two, what it did was reinforce the belief that, first and foremost, people with intellectual disability have a right to choice. Okay, so the old model in the Department of Justice, at least under Obama, I don't know what's going to happen under this current administration, but what they were doing was they were blowing up the sheltered workshop model. Okay, the shelter, so what happened was we took people out of institutions, right, like the Texas state schools or where I, near where I grew up on Pilgrim State and so on. And we put them maybe in group homes or what have you. And then we would send them to sheltered workshops. And oftentimes those sheltered workshops would be, not really in the center of town, okay? And it worked for some people. But if you think about it, it's another form of segregation, isn't it? Because they're in a workshop. They're not being asked, hey, do you want to do something else, Danny? Do you want to do something else? And so the Department of Justice said enough with this, and they've gone around the country to each state effectively blowing up those models, including in Rhode Island. I wrote about that in Rhode Island. And then they were going after Oregon and other states. So that's the change. It's a reinforcement of the spirit of the Americans with Disability Act about choice. You have choice. So, okay. Hi.
Hi. First, I want to thank you for that gorgeous writing.
Oh, thank you.
And, but I wanted to ask you for maybe your observations. There are many others in our society.
Right.
That is just one group of others.
I agree.
And your story today, which I don't remember if you actually had that, about your young life at St. Bonaventure and the group of sort of privileged, but it doesn't have to just be privileged persecution of
I agree.
others. And I wondered if you had some...
I didn't put privilege in quotes, by the way.
No, I did. So I'm just wondering if you have some insights after working on this particular story of other for so many years. How do we protect ourselves, our culture, our society from this way of just, needing to see others as others and protect us from this?
I think it's the eternal challenge, isn't it? And so you're right, there are many others out there. And the way I looked at this case was, people with intellectual disability or people with other disabilities, we don't have to compartmentalize
Right.
and break it down, right? The challenge for all of us has always been, I think, to recognize the worth in one another and to be constantly aware of it. And I think what happened, for example, in Atalissa, the people in Atalissa, some in the media at the time basically portrayed Atalissa as this horrible little place that took advantage of these men. Well, that's not really true, right? We want things to be black and white. The truth is that we all traffic in the muddled gray in the middle. That's where we are. And so the challenge for us, I think, is to constantly doing a gut check. Are we aware of our surroundings? Are we aware of our neighbors? Are we aware of what's happening? And I'm as guilty as anybody. So I think of myself as Atalissa. Do you know what I mean? I don't hold out Atalissa different. I see Atalissa as
Right.
me. So.
Right.
All right.
All right.
All right. Thank you.
Hi, this is kind of specific.
I don't like turning my back. I don't know what people are doing.
This is specific to South Carolina, since I'm going back there, and I have been through Newberry, oh gosh, maybe for 15, 20 years, seeing the turkeys out on the streets. Like in Aiken, South Carolina, where I'm from, we have horses out on the streets, artistic representations. I had no idea. And this is as recent as 3 years ago. There's a Turkey Federation there, and clubs go and visit the Turkey Federation. Guess what I'm getting at is if you can fill me in on if there's anything left that needs to be done there.
Robert Canino was in touch with me just a couple of weeks ago, and there is some kind of development in the case of Leon. And there were other men living in that bunkhouse. And after I wrote a story about it, they were all taken out and placed in a better living circumstance and being accorded the proper medical and other services. So that's been taken care of. And you might see some criminal action, you might see some civil action. I don't think that model exists anymore. I think after the story ran about what happened in Newberry, South Carolina, they blew it up. So, thank you.
I remember the article originally in the New York Times, and it was something you couldn't turn the page on. And
Oh,
it
thanks.
was really, I really appreciated it. You mentioned that the men all had PTSD when they were initially rescued.
Not all of them, not all of them.
Okay,
Yeah.
some, and that makes sense. And I was wondering if you could talk about the kind of psychological care that they've received to the degree that you're aware of that, and if you could explain how the men are doing psychologically now. You know, the image you leave us with at karaoke sounds good, but I'd like to know more about their current psychological condition.
Right. So if I were to take 21 people in this room, there would be 21 individual stories, right? So they're not a collective, they're not a block of people. And so some of the men had no interest and according to the social workers, no real need for any psychological counseling. They were fine. They went through it. It stunk. Let's move forward. Other men have not been able to get past it. And so I know that some of the men have weekly, if not every couple of days, of counseling that continues to this day, which, shows the profound impact on their psyche. I mean, I know, for example, when just to take these guys who were living in that schoolhouse for 20 or 30 years, no matter how bad it was, right, to then be yanked out of it and to find yourself in a motel in Muscatine, even though the motel was a better living circumstance than the bunkhouse, that's what they knew.
Right.
And so I do know that some of the men continue to get counseling, and so that's all I know. I don't know the particulars. I know which men, but I'm not going to share that. But yeah, that continues. So they're on it. I'm telling you, they're on it. And they have all those services available to them that weren't available to them even 10 years ago,
Thank you.
Thank you. Good question. Hi.
Hi. You're always very careful to say they're the men in the bunkhouse, not
Right.
the boys. So I'm wondering, why is the title of the book, The Boys in the Bunkhouse, which seems to reinforce the stereotype?
Well, I think that, I don't know if it really does, but in the newspaper article, it was in quotes, and then the publisher thought, no, that's too confusing, but that's what they were called. And then if you read the book, then you know that it's an ironic use, and certainly through the entire book and in my talk, it's always the men. And I, in fact, make a point of the fact that one guy was punished because he didn't work hard enough, supposedly, so he wasn't allowed to watch television. And I remember thinking, he was 39 years old when that happened. So here's a 39-year-old man being told that he can't watch TV at night. So I think throughout the book and in my talks, I play off that use of the word boys, because they're certainly not boys, they're men. So, good question. Thank you.
Yes, you indicated there have been no criminal prosecutions, but given the long period of time and the fact there are 3 different states involved and that Henry's presumably never paid any FICA, never collected any state tax, including unemployment tax, and transmitted it to the proper authorities, have there been no administrative repercussions for the state officials who are responsible for monitoring this and collecting that tax?
No. I can't explain why. I think there's an argument to be made that Iowa just wanted to get past this. It was a really difficult year when this was exposed for Iowa, and there were all sorts of commissions and hearings, and we're going to do this and we're going to do that, and virtually none of it was done. There were minor tweaks in the regulations governing these kinds of business operations, minor, but nothing that would preclude this from happening again. And no state official was ever reprimanded or lost his or her job over it. And as I said, no one was criminally prosecuted. So.
I might have missed it a moment ago, but I was going to ask about prosecutions. I'm surprised that you haven't mentioned prosecutions. These are corporations that move from one area to the other. They move from one state to the other. You have different jurisdictions, And with all of the places they've been, there's never been a prosecution, a criminal prosecution against the corporation, because obviously those are people who are associated with those corporations.
Right. I can't defend the fact that there hasn't been a prosecution. The Attorney General in Iowa gave as one of the reasons, because I asked, why no criminal prosecution? And the reason I was given was in part because these men, their storytelling might not hold up on the stand. Their sense, so their sense of time, their sense of chronology. And of course, I think any prosecutors, former prosecutors can back me up on this. There are plenty of cases where crimes have been committed against people with intellectual disability, and it's been able to be prosecuted. But that was one of the reasons that the Attorney General gave to me. The two men who ran Henry's Turkey Service, Kenneth Henry and T.H. Johnson, have since died. And so I think the steam went out of the desire for justice. But I can't answer why. I can't answer why.
Thank you. You've done a great job with that book.
Well, Clark Kaufman started it, so yeah. Thank you. Hi.
Hi there.
Uh-oh, you're reading one.
Have to. So the work you've done with this, has this given you any insight into, in this country, undocumented workers who probably work under the radar where companies call the shots and not the workers?
Oh, sure. I've written about undocumented workers, and in other states, the business. Here's the truth. No one really wants to work in a meat processing plant. We don't want to think about where our turkey's coming from tonight. We don't want to think about it. And the reason that these men were employed was because no one else wants to do that damn job. The only others who will are oftentimes undocumented workers. And so this is an issue. So, in Iowa, in Atalanta, Iowa, it may have been men with intellectual disability, but in Minnesota, it could be Somalians. Around the country, it could be people coming from South America. That's the truth. So I see the similarity, and I've written about it too, particularly with refugees. Recently, I wrote about it in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Yes, but that's a good that's an apt comparison. Thank you. Hi.
Hi. Is your work for the Times all-consuming, or are you working on something new?
I'm thinking of going into interpretive dance. What?
Why not?
It is pretty all-consuming, quite frankly, but it's an enjoyable, all-consuming nature. And so I'm always on the lookout for another kind of book. And I think if I'm able to, they're going to do a collection of the This Land columns that'll be out. And one of the benefits of that is it will share the unbelievable photography that the Times has published along with the This Land column over the years, work by Angel Franco and Nicole Bengivino and Todd Heisler, just astounding photography. And so they'll run the columns but really give import to those photographs. So I'm working on that now. But I was saying to someone at lunch that if I write another book, I'm going to try and find something a little happier, because it takes its toll, So, but thank you very much. Last question. Hi.
So I am fascinated that investigative journalists can take a little article from a newspaper or a clipping or something like that and turn it into an incredible story that can make great social change. The only other book that I know of where somebody took a little article, it was a obituary for a gentleman who had died in prison. And that was the beginning of John Grissom's book, Innocent, which later changed a whole trial system and the DNA testing. And I just wondered if there are other books that start from a germ of an article or from some inconspicuous bit of information that that creates social change in the world.
I think there are many, many. A few years ago, you had Sherry Fink here. Do you know she wrote the book about the hospital in New Orleans after Katrina? Was she here? All I can tell you is that journalists, or at least this journalist, I'm always looking for a story. So I'm always reading carefully and then challenging myself. Well, what are these words saying? What is this? What are the possibilities for something larger? I didn't see that news item and say, I'm going to write a book about that. It was not that. Initially, I'm telling you the truth, initially it was, I want to write about that, and I think I could write 1,500 words, right? Then I went to Iowa. I said, 1,500 words cannot contain this. And the more I asked questions, the more I tried to put myself in another person's skin to understand what was going on, it became a year-long project that wound up being a long story in the New York Times, very long. And then even then, I felt this isn't enough. There's more to be told. There's more to be explored. So I think if you interviewed, say, 10 or 15 reporters who specialize in investigations, and I don't really anymore, they would tell you it'll be a line in a document. It'll be a phrase sometimes, and it's challenging yourself. What the hell does that mean? And let's go.
I just thought of one, the Henrietta Lacks book.
Oh, exactly right. Exactly right. So anyway.
Please join me in thanking Dan.
Thank you.